Hello ladies and gents, I'm back again. Thought I would do a review of Lust and Sound, B-movie. This is a documentary about Berlin in the 80s. It's actually a Berlin that I wish I'd seen. A friend of mine actually did actually going back, how long ago was this now? Yeah, it has to have been the early 80s. I remember going to because I was in the army at the time, and I remember going to the battalion, and I remember I was a bandsman, and there were these guys that had been in a lot longer than me, and I remember them every time we had a break, a tea break, coffee break, I'd always remember the chats that they'd have, and they'd talk about Northern Ireland, and they'd talk about other places that they'd been. But one place they always mentioned and had smiles all round was Berlin. They said, "Oh, when we were in Berlin, when we were in Berlin." I thought, what is it about Berlin? And I see it in this documentary. In the 80s, there was a guy called Mike Reeder, and he did sort of documentaries for English television in Berlin, because he was the go-to person. So anybody that wanted to film in Berlin at that time, they'd go to Mike Reeder. And so years later, he did this documentary, and I've just finished watching it, and I think it's absolutely fantastic, and it makes me nostalgic, because I really wished that I would have got to see this Berlin as it was in the 80s before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So Mike Reeder came from Manchester, and he used to work in a record shop, and he liked all the music there. He liked punk rock, and he actually had a picture of the Nevermind the Bollocks, the Sex Pistols, or I think it was a flag with the Queen on the cover, with a safety pin through her nose or through her lips, and all his neighbours were so outraged that he was forced to take it down. So anyway, he was determined to sort of make something of his life, but he wasn't really sure how. And then it was only that he was inspired by krautrock. So it was German rock music of the early 70s. And for someone to have the courage to want to go to Berlin just because of the music is just astonishing. It's not something I think I could have ever have done. But he did it. But in those days, Berlin had a wall around it. So the only way you can get to Berlin was through effectively a corridor. So there were 3 designated motorways. There was a railway, and there was a flight path, which is the only way that you can get from West Germany into West Berlin. And I remember him saying in an interview that he only could get as far as the border of the West German border, and that if he wanted to get into West Berlin, he had to thumb a ride, and because he'd missed his last train, so he had to thumb a lift, and that's how he got to Berlin. And I'm not even sure that he had a place to stay, but Berlin was sort of known as a sort of a squatter town. There was lots of empty buildings that you could squat in, and he was able to find a decent place without having to pay any kind of rent. And everything he said was on the floor. So his mattress was on the floor, and his records were on the floor, and his clothes were on the floor. I'm not even sure, until he actually was able to hang them up, but everything was on the floor, and it was a big space for one person. And if you've only got a few things, then that'll do. And he was able to make something of himself within the scene of Berlin. So he'd sort of he'd be a mixer, and for band or a manager, or he played bass or guitar for various bands and things like that. And any time there were documentary makers, they'd always seek him out. Even New Order would, the band would actually come and visit him in Berlin, or when they would perform, he would interview them and have a laugh with them and a drink with them and stuff like that. So the 80s was a very artistic time. It was like Berlin was very bohemian, and it was really for the arts. And he'd hang out with people like Blixer Bargeld, who was in a band called Einstürzen der Neubauten. And that band was a band of, it was like industrial music, very hardcore, and they would get all sorts of they'd make their own instruments with bits of old engines and pneumatic drills and chainsaws and things like that, and create their own music. And it was very, very hardcore. And I mean, it's not for everyone, but they are very popular, and to this day they're very popular in Berlin, even today. There was lots of protests, student protests against the police, and inevitably or tragically, somebody would actually die as a result of the protests, as it was in Berlin, because it was like a powder keg. It was because the whole city was walled in, and they were trying to clear it up since the war, because the war had such a profound effect on the city that it would take years and years and years to actually try to clear up those areas of Berlin that had been destroyed. Let's see. So the nightlife was very has such a powerful effect for those that actually enjoy that kind of thing. There's a club called Risiko's where they went to, and Christian F., who's from that film Wir Kids from Bahnhof Zoo. It's a famous film that was made in Berlin in the 70s. Then he actually has Nick Cave. Nick Cave just sort of turns up on his doorstep, like from nowhere. And Mike Reeder, being the type of person he is, he invited him in, and he stayed with him until he could find his own place. Something that was really profound that he said that really caught my attention was Berlin at that time was like Disneyland for the depressed. And I have to say that really sort of caught my attention, because I mean, there were a lot of people that were actually starting to leave Berlin at that time. I think there might have been 86, 87, 88, something like that. Then the techno scene sort of started. This was sort of in the late 80s, whereas before then it was more sort of punk bands and guitar-driven bands. And then we actually had the Love Parade, and the Love Parade was when it actually started, to the point where there was 1 million people turning up from all over the world to go to the Love Parade. And then to end the documentary, it was the tearing down of the wall, and that famous speech that Ronald Reagan gave, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Mr. Gorbachev, open up the gate. And when it ended, I was kind of like a sort of like a bit sad, because it was something that I wished I could have seen. It was a Berlin I wished I could have seen, and I never got to see it. And so this documentary, Lust and Sound B-movie, is the closest I'll ever get to see the Berlin that I really wanted to see at that time. And all it was really was just those guys that I'd have a break, we'd have a coffee break, and somebody would say, "Oh, when we were in Berlin," and everybody would look up and smile, and it was almost like something that would sort of help you get through your day, because if you had a hard day and the bandmaster is not too happy with your playing, and you think, "Oh gosh, I wish I could get back to barracks, and I wish I could have something to eat, and I wish I could go out," but you sort of have to sit there and have to take it, because there isn't really much that you can do other than wait for the time for you to finish, pack up, and leave and get back to camp. So, Lust and Sound B movie, I highly recommend it. If you're really into the Berlin scene, you like the Berlin of the 80s, I highly recommend this documentary. And I would also check out Mike Reeder, because he's this really interesting guy who had an incredible life, and I think he still lives in Berlin to this day. So yeah, you might want to check him out on YouTube. Anyway, that concludes this presentation, and until next time, auf Wiedersehen.